Welcome back, everybody, to more from the Sable Eyes. I'm Mitch, and here with me today is Jordan. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you.
And today we are going to be running through the Necrozma Malamar list that ended up finishing 8th in Brisbane Regionals. Now, Jordan, do you know much about this list at all?
I think it's a little familiar. I think I know the guy who made top 8 with it.
Yeah, so Jordan finished 7th seed before Top Cut, and then ended up scrubbing out against Gramble in his top 8 match, but still a pretty solid showing. Well done, Jordan, on top 8.
Thank you. Certainly not upset with the result.
No, it's a pretty decent one, and we're going to run through his list, play a couple of games with it during the week. We're sorry about the kind of fractured upload schedule we've been on, obviously, with Brisbane so recent. We've kind of had our attention removed from the channel for a bit, but we should be back for more content pretty regularly from now on. Okay, so we'll get started. First of all, we're playing Necrozma Malamar. We're probably going to have ourselves 4 copies of Inkay and 4 copies of Malamar. Anything interesting to say about that, Jordan?
I mean, we see some of the alternate Necrozma lists playing a smaller line of Malamar, but it really is important to play 4-4 in this deck. There's no option to even play less. In fact, I even considered playing a Ditto Prism with no other stage 1s, just so I could play a 5th Inkay. That's how important it is.
Yeah, it's a pretty solid card, and since your entire engine is built around it, you don't want to be missing out. It's not really like Blacephalon, where you can get away with having 2. Malamar, you probably want to make sure that you've got access to it whenever you can. So, pretty good option to have 4. The next card that we're going to have a look at is Necrozma GX. You've got 2 copies of that, Jordan. Now, I know going into the tournament, we had a kind of a 58 card list that only had 1 Necrozma in it. Tell me why you've gone for 2.
Yeah, that was definitely a long period of time where I was considering only playing 1, just because there's a lot of matchups where you only really want to attack with GXs, and it's not the best opener, but it really is probably the single attacker you need to rely on more than any other, so it's mainly the risk of prizing it that you really don't want to only have access to 1 copy.
I can completely get behind that. Like I was saying, 58 cards, we only had 1 in it, but one of the big problems that you have is if you're going up against a big hitting deck, or a deck that's got a lot of HP behind it, it's really hard to hit if you don't have access to your Necrozma. It can put you in some pretty dire straits, so definitely worth having 2 of those. Another 2 of, sorry about my voice by the way, another 2 of that we've got is 2 of Marshadow GX, obviously with lots of Zoroark floating around in the format. This is an exceptionally good card to just guarantee your knockouts on those Pokemon. Run us through when you used it, Jordan.
Yeah, so just like the Necrozma GX, it's a card that you could probably get away with only 1 copy of, but having 2 is just safe to make sure that you have it and it's not prized. I mean, obviously, we were expecting quite a lot of Zoroark GX on the weekend, and Marshadow is your go-to in those matchups, but it also just acts as a 1 retreat GX, which can take 1 hits, which is something I really value in this deck, being able to retreat on the first turn if you open it. It seems a lot better than opening the Necrozma GX, so having, in a sense, 4 GXs that you can use to take 1 hits means that you're never going to be too disadvantaged if you get bad prizes most of the time.
Yeah, one of the obvious disadvantages with Marshadow is it's 150 HP, which is pretty low, but ultimately you don't really mind, because normally the only reason Marshadow's down is because you've taken 2 prizes with it. So the idea of playing it is that you're ahead of the prize trade anyway, so definitely a good option for this deck. And one of the good things about Marshadow is it can copy any basic Pokemon's attack that's in the discard, which for this deck is pretty good considering the amount of one-of Pokemon that we've got, and we'll probably run through a few of those now. The first one that we'll go through is Dawnwing's Necrozma GX. It's obviously a pretty solid card, and it can swing a lot of matchups. With Moon's Eclipse GX and Dark Flash. Run us through it, Jordan.
Yeah, so obviously this card it's got a good ability and 2 good attacks, but the main purpose for it is obviously the Moon's Eclipse GX. This is a deck that can very easily just win a prize trade against your opponent if it ever gets ahead. So the Moon's Eclipse allows you to have a chance in matchups where you're not ahead and you're actually behind, and then you can use Moon's Eclipse to get ahead. And once you're ahead in prizes and you've got a bunch of Malamars set up, you can pretty much guarantee that you're going to take a prize or 2 every single turn for the rest of the game. All you need to do is use Moon's Eclipse to get ahead, and you should be fine.
Yeah, another one of those Pokemon that's always good as an attacker in this list is the new Giratina from Lost Thunder. Since it's got its Distortion Door ability, you can, every time it gets knocked out, it can just pop straight back onto the bench. And like you were saying, Jordan, with so many Malamar, it's very easy to power up this guy, and Shadow Impact for 130 is a good amount of damage to do.
Yeah, in my testing, I was finding that Giratina was a good card, but not the one that I would go to as much as some of the other attackers. But throughout the tournament, Giratina was most certainly one of the MVP deck. It was obviously my main attacker against any non-GX deck, being able to cycle a non-EX attacker for the entire game without having to find Rescue Stretcher is so strong.
Yep.
The damage you take from Shadow Impact usually isn't too much of a problem unless you're versing Decidueye. So it's really just such a strong attacker. Sometimes you can even use the 10 damage with Distortion Door to bring 200 HP GXs down to 190, which puts them in range for a 3 energy Necrozma GX. It's got so many uses.
100%, and it's your go-to attacker in the Granbull matchup, which was the one you unfortunately lost to in top 8. But 130 just knocks a Granbull out clean, and one of the big problems that Granbull has is that it struggles to stream attackers sometimes, and Giratina never worries about that because it's always on the field as long as you've got it in the discard. So that's a big plus.
The single copy of Giratina almost just gives you such a, at the very least, a 50-50 matchup with Granbull, if not favourable if you're able to get it off early. But you really do need to make sure that you're able to get it really quickly against Granbull to make sure you never fall behind in prizes, because it's really hard to catch up if they're able to just attack every single turn without fail.
100%. Now, moving on, we got another one prize attacker here, Deoxys. This one for me was, in my testing, when I was testing with this deck, I found that it was probably the one that I went to least. How did you find it, Jordan?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I reckon I used it a lot less than I usually do during Brisbane, because I was focusing more on Tina than I had in the past. But the Deoxys kind of acts like the second copy of Giratina, just like we were talking about with the GX attackers. You really don't want to prize one of your main Pokemon in situations where you need it. So having the Deoxys and the Giratina, they kind of do the same thing in the matchups where they're important, except Deoxys has some of the benefits of being a good opener and being able to take knockouts against some Pokemon with only 2 energy. So I definitely agree with the 1-1 split, but I think I was leaning a bit more towards Giratina than Deoxys on this specific weekend.
Yeah, and it depends on the matchups that you're facing off against as well, because obviously if there's a situation where maybe you're playing against more Buzzwole than anything, then Deoxys is just an absolutely broken attacker, because they struggle to knock it out, and you just knock it out for 2 or 3 energy, and there's nothing they can really do. Obviously, Giratina has the same impact in that matchup, but it's got a retreat cost of 3 over the retreat cost of 1, which is a substantial difference, especially when you're starting with it.
Yeah, the Deoxys is almost exactly the same as the second copy of Tina, except it just acts as a Pokemon that is a good opener as opposed to Tina being a terrible opener.
Yeah, and Giratina is probably the worst one to start with in the entire list.
It's up there.
100%. Well, talking about Pokemon that are probably the worst to start with, this one's probably one of the best to start with in specific matchups, and that's Bell of Silence Charmeco.
Yeah, that's definitely my preferred opener. Honestly, in almost every matchup, even if it's a matchup where you don't really want to be using Bell of Silence, just having the option to bench your attacker and or your in-case and still have 1 retreat is just so useful. But of course, Bell of Silence is pretty much a card that wins not half, but like so many of this deck's matchups. Specifically, Ninetales Stage 2 decks like Gardevoir and Solgaleo just get destroyed by Chimecho. Most Zoroark variants like Zoroark Lycanroc and to some extent Zoroark Decidueye also just get slowed down so much by this card, and as I've said previously, all you need to do is get ahead, and it's so hard for your opponent to catch up against a deck like Malamar.
Yeah, and if you're able to Bell of Silence to stop them setting up whilst you're setting your Malamars up, you can put yourself in a position where you don't need to play any more cards, but your opponent needs lots to catch up. So a good card in combination with Chimecho is the one of Marshadow with Let Loose, so that after you finish doing your Chimechoing and setting your board up, you got your 3 Malamars, your attacker and Chimecho in the active, you can just hit the Marshadow, Let Loose, bring him down to 4, and then just start attacking, and in most cases, people just can't keep up.
Yeah, a pretty common strategy that a lot of people use when they're playing the Ninetales decks against Chomeko is they'll just sit there and use Beacon 3 to 4 times while I'm setting up my Malamars, getting ready for the turn when I do stop using Bella Silence, so that they've got everything they need all ready to go. So the Mars Shadow obviously counteracts that strategy, but it's also just so important to be able to refresh your hand without having to bench a GX, because of course there are some games where if you bench a GX at the wrong time, you can lose you the game. So having access to Mars Shadow, you've got so many ways to search it out. It's super important to get it at the right time.
100%. And then rounding out the Pokemon, we've just got the one-of copy of Tapu Lele. Even though you probably don't want to play it in some matchups, it's just too good a card to not include. Searching a supporter, Jordan, I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but it's an exceptionally powerful ability.
It is super good. And a unique thing about this deck is you do actually have access to Tapu Cure GX, which, while I wouldn't recommend you do it too often, I did actually find myself using that attack once during regionals, so it can come up clutch.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people don't expect as well. Like they Guzma around your main attackers to try and stop you from doing stuff. Maybe they're spreading damage around, and then you just Tapu Cure and you've stuffed their entire strategy up. So it's always worth considering. Moving away from Pokemon now and into supporters, and this is probably one of the easiest supporter lines to write on a deck list. We've just got 4 Cynthia. I don't reckon we're going to talk too much about Cynthia. If you've played the game for 5 minutes, you probably know how good that card is. We've got 4 copies of Guzma. Obviously, you want to be able to move in and out of the active pretty regularly to charge up Pokemon with Malamar. So if you don't have access to one of the switching cards that we have coming up later on, then that Guzma is a good option as well, especially because you want to take the right knockouts at the right time. Anything interesting to say about Guzma, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one of the more important reasons as to why this list specifically needs 4 is that often after using a Necrozma GX to clear off all the energy, the only card that you want to see on the next turn if they don't knock you out is a Guzma, so you can bring it onto the bench, charge it up, and then take another 2-prize knockout on one of your opponent's bench GXs. So it's often a 4-prize swing when you're able to get a Guzma at the right time with this deck.
Yeah, 100%. And it's one of those decks. I've actually found it quite a lot in this format. There's lots of decks in this format that only ever play Guzma once during the game, but if you don't play that one Guzma, it can become a big problem. So making sure that you've got access to it with 4 is probably a good idea. And then rounding out the supporters, we have a 4 line of Lily. It's a little bit thick. Run us through it, Jordan.
Yeah, so Lily could very easily be swapped out for one of a couple other supporter options, ranging from TV Reporter to Sightseer or Sophocles. There are quite a lot of other options, but having 4 copies of Lily is just really important to try and minimize the chances of you needing to use Wonder Tag on the first turn. And it's actually not that bad as a supporter in the mid to late game and compared to a lot of other decks, because when we get into the item count, there are a lot of cards that discard cards from your hand in this deck, so it's not too hard to get full use out of Lily.
Yeah, for sure. One of those things where people often worry about Lily and having a large count of it, because if you get it mid to late game, it draws you 1, maybe 2 cards. But like you said, this list has 4 copies of Ultra Ball, which obviously discards 2 from hand, and has 4 copies of Mysterious Treasure. So you've got 8 search options and all of them discard. So Lily's never a bad option going in there as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the 4 search cards is really what you want to try and get on the first turn anyway. So having a hand with Ultra Ball and Lily is just so strong to be able to set up as many incages as you can turn 1 and really put the pressure on your opponent to deal a lot of damage on the second or third turn.
100%. We've actually got a 9th search option here as well, but it doesn't necessarily discard. Nest Ball. This is one of the counts that I know that we were tossing up whether we wanted to thicken this line or not. In some builds we had 2 just to make sure that we could get those NK going, but you elected for just the 1, Jordan?
Yeah, I think the second Nest Ball is definitely one of the main cards I was considering, except I ended up cutting it because I was finding myself fine setting up most of the time with the 9 search cards, and Nest Ball isn't exactly the most useful card in the late game once you've already got your in-case down. It is good, of course, for getting Mars Shadow GX, which you can't usually use Mysterious Treasure for, but other than that, the second copy of Nest Ball is often being wasted, whereas it's really a card you only want to see in the first couple turns of the game.
Yeah, if you get it turn 1 or 2, you can put those Inky downs, but Inkays down. Ugh, words are hard. But yeah, seeing it late game is not a good sign, especially since late game you're normally looking for maybe 1 or 2 cards out of your Pokemon line, being Baby Marshadow and Tapu Lele, to give yourself the outs to win, and Nespal doesn't really do that for you, so it's probably not the best card to have. Moving away from Ball Search into our items, we have 3 copies of Acrobike. Obviously good to discard Psychic Energy, chuck them in the bin when you can, but it also gives the deck a little bit of speed, which it can sometimes struggle with. You didn't think that maybe 4 would be worth looking at, Jordan?
I think that the count at Acrobike is really tricky, because it's a card that doesn't really seem like it does much when you play. It usually thinking after you've played it, this could have been something better, but it just has so many uses in this deck, because not only do you want to be discarding energy, but you also want to try and discard specific Pokemon at the right time. And as you already mentioned, this is a deck that, unlike most other decks on the first turn, which just want to find like an Elm and then they're done, this deck requires quite a lot more combo pieces to be able to set up. And while it's not that hard to find those combo pieces because of all the 4-offs, Acrobike just makes it a little easier to set up as fast as an Elm does, really.
Yeah, exactly. And you can put things like, you can put your Giratina in the bin, you can put Energy in the bin, you can put Pokemon that aren't relevant in that matchup into the bin as well. So like if you're playing against, I don't know, maybe like a 1-prize attacker and you've got a Necrozma on the top of your deck, you can just bin that straight away because you're probably not going to use it until later on in the game. And one of the good things as well, since this deck's got so many ways to discard, it also has 2 ways to bring those Pokemon back. 2 copies of Rescue Stretcher. Obviously, some lists only play 1, but 2, Jordan, there seems to be a pretty good number based on the amount of discard and stuff that's going on with this.
Yeah, for sure. I think in hindsight, I could very easily see that count being dropped to 1, but 2 really is just a safety net, just in case you do have to prize a couple important cards. I found myself usually only using 1 in most games, but sometimes you verse a Decidueye deck where they're targeting down your Malamars and you really do need that second copy at the right time. Obviously, Giratina makes it not as necessary as it used to be, but allows you to focus those stretches more on Malamars than you used to be able to.
Yeah, and you can shuffle those pieces in as well, which is a big deal.
For sure. I found myself doing that quite a bit, actually.
Yeah. Final trainer cards. These ones are about movement. We've got lots of Pokemon that have 1 retreat cost, so we're playing 3 copies of a skateboard to get those boys moving around. This is a card that you're probably most keen to see on turn 1 or 2, wouldn't you agree?
There's never really a bad time to see a skateboard. You almost always want to have 1 on the board at some point during the game, just as a pivot to move your energy around with Malamar. Obviously, the sleep or paralysis effect is kind of cute as well, which I did actually retreat out of sleep for the first time ever after a hypnosis from my opponent, which was fun. But you really do have to be able to pivot almost every single turn with this deck, so the 1 skateboard in play is so important.
Yeah, and you've got lots of Pokemon that you can stick it on as well, like Marshadow and Lele. Obviously, when they're on the field, they're not doing much more than sitting there, so you may as well put an skateboard on them. Marshadow GX has got 1 retreat, Chimecho's got 1, Deoxys has 1, all of your Inkays have 1, so it's a good card to have and just plop onto a Pokemon so that you know is going to be around for a long time to give you that pivot. For those other Pokemon that maybe have 2 or 3 retreat, your Necrozmas, your Giratinas, your Dawnwings, we've got 2 copies of Ultra of the Moon. Gives you that extra flexibility when you're retreating, but it also lets you contest the Stadium War as well.
Yeah, exactly. Field Flora is a card that I would have highly considered playing in this deck, just because Stadiums can be pretty annoying. Shrine of Punishment is not something you want to see in play for too long, but Ultra of the Moon kind of has 2 purposes, in that it obviously counts stadiums and helps with your maneuverability. There are a lot more Pokemon with more than 1 retreat in this deck now compared to older builds now that Giratina is out. If you play open Giratina and you don't have access to Ultra of the Moon, it can be really ugly pretty quickly if you have to kind of sacrifice some of your draw to use an early Guzma just to get out of the active. It can be pretty inconvenient.
and it can really hinder your setup as well. First couple of turns, you don't want to be sacrificing that draw to get something out of the active. You really want to just be setting up Malamar so that you're set for the late game. So that Ultra of the Moon means you can just sack an energy, chuck it in the bin, it doesn't matter anyway, and then put something up in the active that you're not super worried about getting knocked out.
Yeah, for sure. And also, the other good thing about Ultra of the Moon is that it's a card that really gives you a super good matchup against some of these control decks that were popping up. Even though we didn't see too many of them in Brisbane, if you do pair against a Zoroark control or some of those stall decks, their main win condition is to stall a Malamar or a Dawnwing's Necrozma in the active, and Ultra of the Moon almost completely eliminates that win condition for them.
And then to finish off, to round out our deck, we've got 11 copies of Psychic Energy. We started off our list, or Jordan's list, with 10. Give us the thoughts behind going up to 11.
Yeah, so originally the 11th Psychic was actually the second nestable, but I found in most of my solitaire games when I was trying to figure out how to make the list as consistent as possible to get a turn 2 attack, the one card that I found myself consistently missing was either an energy in the discard for a Malamar or even an energy attachment to retreat or to be that final energy that you need to declare an attack on the second turn. It was always just one off from being like a perfect turn every game, so adding the extra Psychic Energy kind of increased the consistency just as much, if not more, than Nespal was, because I was still setting up Malamars pretty consistently, but not always being able to trigger Psychic Recharge when I needed to.
Yeah, and I found that same thing when I was testing. You would think that with 10 energy you'd hit them pretty regularly, but because you want to have lots in the bin and you want to have them consistently in your hand so that you can attach every turn, sometimes you just miss them, and missing it at a single energy with this list can be the difference between winning and losing sometimes. So I really like that extra Psychic. If you were going back to Brisbane with the knowledge that you have now, Jordan, are there any changes that you'd make? Any things that maybe you didn't need or you might have preferred?
Yeah, there's definitely a few cards that I think I could have gotten away without playing, specifically the second Rescue Stretcher, the second Ultra of the Moon, and maybe even one of the 4 copies of Lily, or even the second Mars Shadow. Those are all cards that I could see myself cutting realistically, but I don't think there's anything I really was missing. I mean, in the losses that I had, I realistically drew fairly poor opening hands, and this list is pretty much as good as you can get it for boosting your turn 1 consistency. And the only other matchups I lost was to Decidueye players who were able to really smartly play around taking out Malamars, so cutting the Rescue Stretcher for that matchup wouldn't be wise at all either.
No, I think we've got ourselves a pretty solid list here. There's obviously some directions you can go. You've got lots of 1 prize attackers that you can kind of shuffle in, and you can make all sorts of decisions when it comes to that. But I think what we've got at the moment is probably a pretty solid 60. I wouldn't say it's perfect. There's still things we could work on, because obviously you didn't win, so it can't be perfect, can it? But
exactly.
But it's still pretty gosh darn close. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to have a couple of games with this one. We're going to try and increase the speed at which we're doing different decks over the next couple of weeks, just to make it a little bit more interesting, because I don't know about you, Jordan, but for me it started to get a bit of a drag over the last couple of weeks playing the same thing every day. So we might maybe do a couple of games with this one, and then we'll I don't know, hit something else up from Brisbane Regionals. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea. I mean, it definitely helps being able to look at a bunch of different decks at the same time.
For sure. Alright, cool. Well, we'll leave it there for the moment. Jump in tomorrow where hopefully we've got ourselves another game up for you. You never know, we might be able to get that secret 9th place Blacephalon list go on the channel as well, Jordan. What do you reckon?
Sounds exciting.
Oh, so exciting. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. If you're interested in more content like this, hopefully with a slightly less raspy voice in future, then like, subscribe, comment, do whatever it is that you need to do to get yourself going. And apart from that, thanks everyone for watching. We'll catch you all next time. See ya.